lot of this behavior on tariffs, the commentary on the Ukraine war, the commentary on Canada, a lot of this is Trump, and he's just unbound, and he doesn't have a good sense of discipline. He's not really a politician. He doesn't, he kind of like won the presidency by a fluke, and I just think he doesn't quite know how to actually be the president, right? He's kind of in there because he didn't want to go to jail, stuff like that. I mean, he's not actually really committed to the office and the institutions of U.S. government, and so he just doesn't feel like it's a problem to go on TV and say outlandish stuff like this.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Professor Robert Kelly on the show. You might remember him as the dad that had his kids storm his BBC interview all those years ago. He's spoken to us about this phone conversation between Putin and Trump today, what it means if Trump basically says that he can take 20% of that occupied land in Ukraine that Russia currently has. What it means if President Trump starts to recognize Crimea as Russian territory. We've spoken to him about the rhetoric of Donald Trump, whether he's making things up as he goes. He doesn't think he's a real politician, not a new stance, but certainly interesting to discuss. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Pusan National University. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Now, we'll start with what's going on today. We've got Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. They will have a phone conversation today to discuss these conditions that Russia want in terms of signing on to this 30-day ceasefire. Obviously, Ukraine has said that they want this. They're signing on to, waiting on Russia. Trump says that the two leaders will discuss land, dividing up assets and power plants. So how do you expect this conversation to go, especially when it comes to so much doubt surrounding whether Ukraine will give up their land, the 20% of land that Russia now occupies?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit concerning that Trump and Putin are negotiating over Ukraine's head. I mean, I think this has been a concern really since Trump re-entered the presidency a couple months ago, right? I mean, it's become pretty clear that Donald Trump has this real affection for Vladimir Putin that I think we've all, as analysts, have really struggled to explain over the last decade. We heard all these stories that maybe Putin has some kind of compromising material on him or something like that. But for whatever reason, Trump genuinely seems smitten, sort of almost enamored, if you will, by Vladimir Putin. He never criticizes him, which is something that many people have noticed, that Trump is often very sort of sharp and arguably aggressive or even cruel to his opponents, and he never is to Vladimir Putin. And so this is this kind of weird contingency with him, and it looks like Trump wants to negotiate a ceasefire, like I said, over the head of the Ukrainians. My big concern, and first of all, I mean, that's sort of the real problem, obviously, is a moral one, which is that the Ukrainians are, the ones being attacked, and they should be involved. But just from a strictly strategic point of view, right, if one of the counterparties to a conflict is not present at the table, if they're not actually there, then it's not really clear that Donald Trump can even deliver the ceasefire or the war halt that he is promising. A couple of weeks ago in Saudi Arabia, I think that was the big problem. At least now the Ukrainians are on board. At least we're talking to them. Because if the Ukrainians reject the deal that Trump brings home, then, I mean, the whole exercise was kind of pointless.
Then it goes back to square one, which is kind of cause for concern, Bob, because that's the whole thing, is that there are certain things that Ukraine seem to be willing to negotiate now after that very controversial meeting in the Oval Office. But I don't see any expert I've spoken to, I don't see Ukraine, Zelensky, giving up any of that land, that 20% of land. But on that note, Bob, what do you think it says about President Trump? Because there are reports circulating that ahead of this meeting, he will tell Putin that he will start referring to Crimea as Russian territory. Yeah. There's only a handful of countries, including North Korea, which you're an expert in, that refer to Crimea as Russian territory. Right. So what do you think that says about Donald Trump, that he's willing to do that?
Yeah, again, I think what we've all sort of seen in the last couple of months, which is that Donald Trump really has this affection for autocratic regimes. And my concern being out here in Asia is that when Trump turns his attention to East Asia, that he's going to be like this with Xi Jinping of China, with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. I think there's genuine concern out there that Donald Trump isn't committed to liberal democracy and just will not stand behind U.S. allies if they get into a conflict. I think, for example, the NATO security guarantee is probably not reliable anymore. I think this is going to have a lot of follow-on consequences like nuclear proliferation, which we really haven't thought through. I think for the Ukrainians, what that means is that any kind of a lasting deal is going to have to involve some kind of European solution, which is to say that the biggest powers in Europe, like Germany and France and Britain, those really the big three, maybe Poland, are going to have to be involved in some way in providing guarantees to Ukraine, because I just don't think American guarantees are credible anymore, right? Again, because of Trump's sort of affection here for the Russian autocrat. I do think when it comes to a final termination of the conflict, I do think, however, unfortunately, that Ukraine is probably going to have to lose some territory. I think at this point, the line of control will probably become an informal border. We know that the Ukrainians won't accept this, right? You could get a situation like you have in India, where you have an informal line of control between India and Pakistan, where neither side actually recognizes as a border, but it's kind of emerged as one. You have the same kind of scenario here in Korea. I think what many people, I think in the analyst community would like to see from Donald Trump, though, is not give that up preemptively, right? That is something that we should negotiate with the Russians, right? So, okay, we'll kind of like let you kind of slice off this chunk of Ukraine, but we want a lot of other stuff back. We want you not to meddle in Ukrainian politics, not to try to corrupt Ukrainian politicians, right? To sort of not station a large army on Ukraine's border. I mean, there are things that we can negotiate. The Ukrainians can make concessions, right, on some of these issues, but they should get something back, right? And I think that's been the big shock out there, again, in the analyst community, out there on Twitter and at the conferences and whatever, that Trump seems to be giving all of this stuff away to Putin without actually getting very much back. And I think that's the real concern for the Ukrainians. And like I said, I think that's eventually going to lead to a breach between Ukraine and the United States, and will push the Ukrainians towards the Europeans, who I think are a little bit more honest about Russia's threat to Europe than Donald Trump is.
Yeah, because, Bob, we aren't hearing any sort of concessions from Russia's side. We don't know what they're giving up. Whether that comes out in a phone conversation today with Putin and Trump, perhaps, but at this late stage, Russia is not giving up anything. So on the note of what you were saying before, right, because if Ukraine does have to give up some sort of land, right, how do you police that? Because you've got Russia taking over certain parts of Ukraine, and then you have Ukraine giving up any sort of security from the United States. So who's to say that Russian members of the community at all would not seep into Ukraine any further because they don't have any protection? Is that when Europe, the UK, step up and say, look, we'll help with security to make sure that if you have to give up certain parts of your land, you won't have to give up any more as the day goes on?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think that's basically the way it has to be. In fact, if I were the Ukrainians, that's the deal I would insist on, or I wouldn't stop fighting, right? I mean, again, I think one of the problems from the Trump side of this is that the perception seems to be in the White House that you can sort of negotiate directly with Putin and get a deal and just kind of force it on the Ukrainians. But that's pretty unlikely. I mean, the Ukrainians have made it pretty clear after 3 years that they're willing to fight. They're willing to carry terrible losses. Their cities are shelled on a regular basis, and they won't just give up because Donald Trump tells them to, right? I mean, Trump continually America's big and powerful, but I think Donald Trump continually overestimates the ability of the United States to basically coerce countries to do what we want them to do, right? I mean, Trump is trying to bully Canada and NATO, the European states, Denmark over Greenland, and it's not working, and I just don't think he's going to be able to do that in Ukraine. So my guess is Trump will probably abandon Ukraine. He'll just kind of like leave it to its fate. And then the real guarantor on the ground, to answer your question, I think, is got to be the Europeans that are still broadly committed to liberalism and democracy, which Donald Trump, quite honestly, in my opinion, doesn't really believe in. And again, that's got to be the most militarily efficacious powers on the continent. That means Britain, France, Germany, possibly Poland. And those troops are going to have to be pretty forward deployed. They're going to have to be pretty close to the line of control for it to be a credible deterrent. And the Ukrainians are going to insist on that, because if they don't get it, their fear is that the Russians are going to reinvade in a couple of years. And I think that fear is correct. Right?
Because there is so much speculation that Putin is waiting out these 4 years of Trump's administration to launch another full-scale invasion. So I guess right now, UK, British, French troops on the ground might not be a reality right now, but it might be a reality when a peace deal is brokered and Ukrainians need some sort of security on the ground, basically sitting on the border of whatever land they give up. So that might be the reality of how Europe steps up in the face of the aftermath of a peace deal that might be brokered. But Bob, so many people think that the way Donald Trump interacts with Vladimir Putin is a strategy, that he knows how to deal with someone with such a dictatorial nature. And perhaps he sees himself in him, we don't know. But do you think that's true, or are you more of the understanding that Donald Trump is actually pro-Russia winning this war?
I think okay. That's actually a really great question. I do not actually. I'm not actually of the school that says that Putin has some kind of like compromising material. I think just Donald Trump doesn't really believe in democracy and checks and balances and limits on executive authority and stuff like that. You know, if you listen to him on Twitter and on TV and his social media service, he constantly talks about, you know, how the president has unlimited authority and the president can do whatever he wants, and how Al Capone was great. He just said on Twitter the other day, the great Al Capone, right? I mean, he has this kind of gangsterish mentality about the office, and I think that's what's provoked so much anxiety. You see that in the way that Elon Musk is sort of cutting away through the government without going through Congress. Trump is governing through executive order. I mean, it's, you know, there's a big debate, is Trump a fascist? I don't want to go there, but I mean, he has a kind of authoritarian style, which I think is what brings him to be more comfortable around authoritarians. Kamala Harris said this in the election last year, and I think she was correct, that he likes autocrats because he wants to be one. And I think, I genuinely think that Donald Trump is a threat to U.S. democracy. I share that opinion. And I think that's one of the reasons why he likes Putin. I think he admires the way Putin governs Russia and would like to govern like that inside the United States, where, of course, he faces much greater institutional checks. So I think that's really all it is. I don't actually think there's some kind of conspiracy out there and the rest of it. But the real problem, of course, is that because he likes Putin so much, right, it looks an awful lot like he's going to sort of throw the Ukrainians under the bus. And I think that's the real problem. If you're the Europeans, that's simply not an acceptable outcome, because that feeds Russian aggression, and then they're going to come back in a couple of years. And I think this is where there's going to be a European-U.S. breach, because the Europeans are not, and the Ukrainians are not going to agree to a deal that just sort of throws Ukraine to the Russians. I mean, that would be terrible for European security, and they're going to fight. And I don't know if Trump cares enough to resolve that without just allowing NATO to fracture.
Yeah, especially because I think a lot of European leaders are of the impression that it doesn't stop at Ukraine. It will seep into Poland and keep furthering on. It's one of those things, when a dictator tells you what they're going to do, believe them. This is what he said he's going to do. But Bob, Donald Trump, everything when it comes to Donald Trump comes down to money, it comes down to feeding the US economy, it comes down to strengthening America first. We've even seen this with Elon Musk when it comes to I guess, cutting funding. And then Elon Musk has come out and spoken about how the US could go broke if this happens. But then this rhetoric has been turning away Europe, Canada, NATO countries, because it seems as if right now he's choosing Russia, which is an economy that doesn't even reach the size of Texas. So what is the point of alienating Europe when it comes to their economy and choosing Russia's dwindling economy over former big allies with large economies? Does that make sense?
No, and I don't think anybody really in the analyst community actually believes that either. Again, sort of in the area that I operate in, right? Again, sort of the conferences and all that. I mean, I don't know anybody who really thinks that this is a good idea. And certainly, I think the response inside from sort of U.S. defense intellectuals, and in my area specifically, international relations as an academic discipline, I think there's actually a lot of concern about why Trump is doing this, and exactly to the point that you just make, right? I mean, Russia's GDP, Russia's gross domestic product, is about $2 trillion a year, which is, I think, something like 1/10 or 1/15 of what the European Union's GDP is, right? Russia's economy is smaller than Germany, France, Britain, I believe even smaller than Italy. It's about the same size as Spain. If I get the numbers correct, and you can just sort of check those numbers. The point is that, as you said, Russia's pretty technologically backward because it's been sanctioned, of course, and sort of cut off from modern technologies. We see that in the Ukraine war, where the Russians are using Soviet-era technology, and so Russia is a really odd partner, right, for the United States. And again, I think this is the most obvious explanation for that is Trump's personal affinity, his personal affection for Vladimir Putin. There is one possible strategic argument that the Trump administration has been throwing around that might work, that might explain some of this. And the idea here is that we're going to sort of like give up on Ukraine, or kind of like give them a bad deal in order to pull Russia away from China, in order to use Russia against China to help isolate China, because China is the greater threat to the United States over the coming decades. I agree geopolitically that China is a much greater threat for the United States in the next 40 years or so. The possibility of a second Cold War, I think, is real, and it would be nice if the Russians would help us. But it doesn't look like Putin actually wants to do that. I mean, there's not much evidence to suggest that Putin actually wants that breach. The Chinese have helped him a great deal in the conflict. So maybe that's the master plan. But honestly, I'm not sure that Donald Trump is playing like 8-dimensional chess. I
Yeah.
think he's just kind of winging it, to be honest.
And most analysts, and I feel like you might agree with this, Bob, is that when I ask about how China is viewing the United States' interaction with Russia, they all say that China's looking at the US thinking they look weak. And it's furthering that desire to start to plan to invade Taiwan because the United States is pushing away their biggest allies, especially when it comes to in the Pacific region and in that South China Sea. So it will be interesting to watch that. But we're going to get into more, I guess, domestic relations now to wrap up the interview. We've seen Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, going to France, going to the UK to meet King Charles and Keir Starmer for his first international trip and breaking that protocol, Bob, of which is he's meant to visit the United States first. Amid this tension with Trump, he's continuing to say that that Canada should join the US, become the 51st state. So how tense do you think this relationship right now is between these two long-standing allies, especially amid tariffs and back and forth public spats?
Yeah, I think it's a real shock. I mean, it's not even clear where this came from, right? I mean, Donald Trump's voters weren't told this last year. I mean, if you watched the American election campaign last year, there was nothing at all about how the United States was going to engage in local continental expansionism. You know, Greenland, Canada, Trump's talked about bombing Mexico, seems to be interested in retaking the Panama Canal. I mean, all of these ventures, if we actually did this, all these countries would resist. This would require the use of American military force, which would provoke all kinds of problems. I mean, Canada would become a quagmire. It'd be like Iraq on America's northern border. I'm not sure if the Trump people have remotely thought that through. The same thing in Panama. If we went back to Panama, it would turn into a guerrilla war. It'd be Vietnam all over again. We'd be there for 20 years fighting rebels in the jungle. Yeah, I mean, I just don't know. Again, this is what I mean when I think that Donald Trump isn't really playing 8-dimensional chess. I just don't think the president is really thinking this through. I think these things kind of come into his head and he just kind of shoots them out on the internet, on Truth Social or whatever. He doesn't really have a lot of good impulse control. I think we can all agree about that with Donald Trump. And he just says this stuff, right? And he gets sort of hung up on things. I would be shocked if the United States were to actually try to use force to annex Canada. But to your point, I mean, he does keep bringing it up, right? I mean, it was, I guess, kind of funny, you know, a month ago. And I mean, I think Americans maybe are a little bit to blame about this, right? Because the Americans often kind of treat Canada like it's a joke and it's not really its own country, you know, the South Park movie and all that. But I mean, we shouldn't actually, right? I mean, Canada's actually been a really good partner of the United States for a really, really long time, right? They were at Normandy. They helped us a lot after 9/11. I mean, Canada's been an excellent neighbor for the United States for a century. And it's really kind of shocking. And I just don't, again, I don't know what the Trump endgame here is, right? Alienating Canada, right? I mean, what purpose does that, how does that suit American national security? Unless we're actually going to absorb Canada and invade it, there's no point to constantly provoking them. And of course, if we invaded Canada, that would just be, I mean, that would break NATO overnight. The United States would be completely isolated. So I'm actually pretty surprised. I imagine that most of the people around the president know that this is an error. I would imagine that NSA Waltz and Secretary of State Rubio both would like the president to stop talking about this. But you know, the Republican Party is kind of cultish now. Trump is like the great leader, you know, and he says stuff, and people just aren't willing to contradict him the way they were, you know, when he first emerged like 10 years ago.
Well, just a final question for you, Bob. The justification for this is just been so bizarre because most polls, as you mentioned, have about 90% of Canadians opposing this, but then you see members of his administration backing it. We saw Marco Rubio backing this, but this is a sovereign country that borders the United States. Is this not sounding a little bit like Groundhog Day? Is this not sounding a little bit like rhetoric familiar to what Vladimir Putin has just done?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the concerns that I think Canadians have been sort of tossing around. I was at a conference, a sort of NATO event for East Asia a couple of weeks ago, and there are Canadians there who were saying, you know, is this like the American version of the Ukraine conflict, where this sort of weak neighbor and the Americans want to absorb us like Putin has done in Ukraine? And yeah, as you said, I mean, it's just, unless the United States is actually going to militarily absorb Canada, which would be a huge venture. There are 40 million people and they would fight. It would lead to an insurgency. Even if we won the war, there'd almost certainly be an insurgency. We'd be fighting in the cities and in the hills against resistance for a decade, right? So even if we, that's really the only route to get unification between Canada and the United States. I mean, the Canadians have made it really, really clear they don't want this. And again, it's just not clear why this is being said, other than Trump's own personal paranoias and conspiracy theories, and that's the way I read this. That I think a lot of this behavior on tariffs, the commentary in the Ukraine war, the commentary in Canada, a lot of this is Trump, and he's just unbound, and he doesn't have a good sense of discipline. He's not really a politician. He doesn't, he kind of like won the presidency by a fluke. And I just think he doesn't quite know how to actually be the president, right? He's kind of in there because he didn't want to go to jail, stuff like that. I mean, he's not actually really committed to the office and the institutions of U.S. government. And so he just doesn't feel like it's a problem to go on TV and say outlandish stuff like this. I mean, he's a real outlier in American presidential history.
You think he's making it up on the spot, Bob?
Yeah, I do. I actually think the president is winging it. I mean, if you look at, I wrote a lot about the president's interaction with Kim Jong-un in 2000, the leader of North Korea, in 2017, 18, 19. And it was pretty clear if you read the transcripts and you actually sort of like follow what was discussed in the meetings that Trump was just pulling it out of the air. He sort of flew into Singapore in the summer of 2018 for the big thing. That was when everybody covered it. I went to Singapore as part of the BBC. It was this big coverage. It was going to be this big breakthrough. And Trump just walked in the room with no prep. And we know now from the people around him who wrote their books that Trump didn't prepare for it at all. He didn't know anything about ballistic missiles. He didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. Didn't know anything about the conventional balance in Korea. He just kind of walked in there and he just winged it. And that's my sense of this, is that Trump is just kind of thrown it together as he goes. It's not a conspiracy. It's incompetence.
And we'll be watching that conversation tonight, Robert. There's so much going on, and it was great to get your analysis. So thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thanks for having me.